The prayer. Lord, the God of righteousness and truth, grant to our Queen and to her government, to members of the Legislative Assembly, and to all in positions of responsibility, the guidance of your Spirit. May they never lead the province wrongly through love of power, desire to please, or unworthy ideas, but laying aside all private interests and prejudice, keep in mind their responsibility to seek to improve the condition of all. Honorable members, please be seated. Honorable members, I now invite the Honorable, the Associate Minister of the Status of Women, to proceed to the main doors of the chamber. Members, I have received word from the Chief Electoral Officer of Alberta, the report of the returning officer for the constituency of Fort McMurray-Lac-La-Biche containing the results of the by-election conducted on March 15th, 2022, which states that the by-election was conducted in the constituency of Fort McMurray-Lac-La-Biche, and that Mr. Brian Jean was duly elected as the member for Fort McMurray-Lac-La-Biche.
Mr. Speaker, I introduce to you and to this chamber Mr. Brian Jean, the new member for Fort McMurray-Lac-La-Biche, who is taking his oath as a member of the Assembly, has inscribed the roll, and now claims his right to take his seat.
Honourable members, let the honourable member take his seat. Orders of the day, orders du jour.
Government bills and orders for second reading. Bill 2, Financial Statutes Amendment Act 2022. Adjourned debate. Member Loyola.
The honourable member for Edmonton Ellerslie has 5 minutes remaining should he choose to use it. Are there others wishing to join in the debate for second reading? Bill 2, Financial Statutes Amendment Act 2022. I see the honourable member for Edmonton Manning has risen.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's an honour to rise and welcome everybody back after our Easter weekend to speak to the Financial Statutes Amendment Act 2022 in second reading. Now, Mr. Speaker, as we know, this is a financial bill, and it is speaking specifically to the budget that the government has put forward for the people of Alberta. Now, when the budget was drafted, as we all know, it was drafted previously to what we were seeing with the increase in inflation, the spending within COVID, and the increase in the oil revenue that the province is now benefiting from. What we have not seen, however, is this government responding to those factors. So, obviously within the Statutes Amendment Act, there are pieces that I think many Albertans are concerned with. And those concerns, I think, are valid. As we look at what is happening across the province, and of course happening across the country, is that inflation has significantly increased over the last 2 years. What we've seen is that on average it's raised about 5.7%. A significant increase, I would say, in regards to the cost of living, not only in Alberta but across Canada. Now, what we haven't seen, obviously, are wages keeping up with that inflation. The wage right now officially would be at about 3.1% over the last year. And of course, again, like I said, inflation being 5.7. Now, because of that, what we know is that the people of Alberta's wages are not able to keep up with the cost of living that is happening across the province. We've seen utility rates substantially increase. Yesterday, natural gas was on a tear. I think it's up to 8 cents right now a kilojoule. We've seen the price of fuel increase substantially. We've seen the price of looking at our basic needs, such as our food costs, increasing substantially. And yet we've seen nothing within this bill or this budget that is addressing any of those cost pressures. Now, the major concern around that, as we all know, is that when inflation continues to increase and our wages aren't able to keep up with that, our purchasing power also substantially decreases. And so Albertans are at a place right now where they're not able to take their earnings and reinvest that into our economy. Now, to have a budget introduced into this legislature that is purely based on the price of oil, for the government to be applauding the fact that they have a balanced budget, again, on the price of oil, which is a resource that all Albertans own and should have some form of benefit from. We have not seen that same respect for that resource and the value of that resource reinvested into the needs of Albertans. Now, the government could have done a couple things, and I've spoken about those repeatedly since this budget's been introduced. One of the major ones would be the fact that they should have looked at the inflation. They should have looked at the fact that Albertans' incomes are not keeping up with the cost of inflation. And they should have reversed their decision when it comes to taxing personal income tax. Because of course what we know is that the average family is now going to lose about $500 alone on their basic personal exemptions when it comes to their income tax. That's pretty substantial at a time where the discrepancy between inflation and wages is significant. And we know inflation is going to continue to go up. We saw the Bank of Canada already just recently in the last couple of days increasing in the interest rates in relation to mortgage payments, in relation to car payments, that will put more stress on the average Albertan. Now that $500 that could have been part of the basic personal exemption could have been put back into the pockets of Albertans to help them address the increased costs that we're now seeing. But the government chose not to do that, which I believe they should still reconsider, given the fact that we're still in second reading, to be able to look at this bill, reconsider the decisions that have been made, and support Albertans by giving that $500 back. That's one simple solution. Now, of course, the other piece of that is that we saw this government promise a $150 rebate, which Albertans have not seen yet. At a time where, as I said, not only yesterday, we saw the price of natural gas significantly increase pretty much overnight, knowing that those bills now at the end of this month are going to be substantially higher. Again, the promise that this government made to help bring down those costs has not been presented to the people of Alberta, nor have they received any type of relief in regards to that. Now, there were other things that this government chose to do, which was basically looking at, again, another tax on inflation for AISH recipients, because they're going to lose about $3,000 in real purchasing power with the changes that have been made to AISH. Seniors couples that are on the Alberta Seniors Benefit Plan are also going to lose about $750, given the fact that this government has not kept up with inflation. And of course, there's other hidden fees that were introduced within this budget: tuition increases, park fees, insurance costs, utility bills, all of those things that the government has the ability to create policy that would help bring down those costs. This government has chosen to ignore and not introduce anything in regards to this particular bill. And I think it's disingenuous to Albertans to say that we should be celebrating this budget, because as I've said, a balanced budget is only good if it helps the people of Alberta. And there's a way to do it. I mean, we look at the budget and we look at the projected value of oil, which I think was at a very low number of $70 a barrel, I believe. Might have been a little bit less. And we're already over $100 a barrel. So there is going to be a significant amount of revenue coming into the province that was never budgeted within this piece of legislation. And because it wasn't budgeted, the government will come out next quarter and try to celebrate how they've even done better than what they told Albertans they initially thought they were going to do. And yet, there will be no policy changes, no legislation that we have seen that will actually speak to the pressures that Albertans are facing. And you can balance a budget and still make sure that you're providing services. The significant cuts to healthcare, the conflict within the bargaining process between our healthcare workers and the government right now, the request to take substantial wage decreases at a time where this government is talking about the amount of revenue, I will accept an interjection.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, through you to the member from Edmonton Manning. I think it's particularly worth noting, not just in this House, but for Albertans in general, that this budget, this UCP budget, in fact, was underestimating the revenue from oil and gas quite dramatically. While we don't have to calculate the exact amount now, because this is a this is an unfolding story as we speak, right? I think the government tabled in this budget a $500 million surplus, something like that. It's considerably more than that. It's exponentially more than that. And, you know, what I fear is that cynically this UCP government will try to buy Albertans off in the next election by suddenly appearing with billions of dollars of surplus, you know, in a matter of months. In fact, we probably have that right now, in fact.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for the interjection. He is correct. As of right now, with the tax on inflation, in fact, what the government of Alberta will be doing is getting a $1 billion surplus in just income taxes alone. So $1 billion off of Albertans just by the fact that they did not remove their decision to tax personal income tax. So it's $1 billion. Now, of course, that is a $1 billion tax grab. By taxing inflation, failing to index the income tax system, all of our constituents should be very concerned. I know I have constituents in my own riding whose bills alone on utilities have doubled. That $500 that they would have received back on their income taxes would have paid at least 1 month of their utility bills. And yet, we haven't seen a shift or a change by this government to move that back into and look at making sure that Albertans have their income tax returned to their pockets at a time when they don't need to be doing it. Now, of course, the other piece of that, and as the honourable member did say, is that this is one of those things where this government continues to try to position themselves to go into another election where they can start celebrating surpluses, talk about how great they did fiscally. And we see that even with the 13 cents rebate on the provincial tax that this government has put on fuel. Now, it's not a balanced 13 cents. And I've talked about this already in the House a few times. We know, for our agricultural industry specifically, they used to have a tax exemption on their dyed fuel. It was part of the reason for that was to make sure that our agricultural industry still had a competitive advantage, and a comparative advantage across jurisdictions, so that those costs that they were incurring were able to be offset. And it was one way to look at decreasing some of the input costs that were going to be required to get, you know, crops ready, to do aerial spraying, all of those things. And yet we didn't see the government make an adjustment there. Dyed fuel, regular fuel, they're now the same. Why the government chose not to do that, I don't understand. Especially at a time where we continuously hear from our agricultural sector the stressors that they have when it comes to the increase in input costs. Fertilizer is going up, feed costs are going up, fuel is going up, their transportation costs are going to go up. The demand on the supply chain is going to be extreme come harvest. And yet we saw nothing within this piece of legislation that would address that. Now, again, at a time where we see many of our corporations doing quite well, our oil and gas industry doing very well, we again saw this government hold fast on keeping the corporate taxes low, but yet increasing every Albertan's taxes. It doesn't make sense. Why does this government feel that Albertans should continuously have to keep paying more out of their pockets at a time when they're cutting the corporate income tax? It's one more tax on Albertans and a complete disregard for the corporations that are benefiting from the natural resources of our province that are owned by the people of this province. There should be a balance between what this government expects from corporate income tax and what they expect from personal income tax. But yet they didn't index corporate taxes. They left it flat. And that, I think, is a real concern because, again, we're talking about a resource that is owned by the people of Alberta, a resource that corporations are benefiting from, and yet they're not paying the taxes back to the very people that own that resource at a time when this government feels like Albertans should have to pay more, at a time where inflation goes up, at a time where their wages are not matching the cost of inflation. And we know, and this government will continuously talk about the fact that, well, this is about job creation and reinvesting into the job market, but yet we haven't seen the evidence that these corporations that haven't had to pay the income tax at the same rate as personal income tax, haven't had to keep up with inflation, are not actually creating or reinvesting into the market. Because if they were, we'd have way more jobs. What we are seeing is that the revenue that many of these corporations are benefiting from, the profits that they're making, are actually just being put back into their dividends, they're paying their shareholders, and they're not actually reinvesting it into the employment market. And so that is another big concern, because when this government continuously talks about employment and the jobs that are being created in Alberta, one, we're behind the rest of the country, still. But on top of that, the jobs that this government continuously talks about are part-time positions. They're not full-time. They're not positions that are paying mortgages that are high-paying. They're lower-earning part-time positions. And the government should have an expectation that when you give a corporate income tax cut, because that's what it is, and when you're trying to give corporations a benefit to be job creators, that they would create full-time, long-term mortgage-paying positions. Yet we haven't seen that. So then why are they continuously getting a tax cut? Why are Albertans having to pay more in their personal income taxes when corporations don't? So, Mr. Speaker, I do believe that this piece of legislation has fallen short. I believe the government could have been far more in tune to the realities of the markets and what was going on with inflation and the cost of living, and the fact that we know our wages aren't keeping up in this province to those demands. They could have created policy, and they could have done that within their legislation to ensure that all Albertans are able to pay their bills, are able to pay their mortgages, and that we are successful as we move forward, and that that purchasing power that we need Albertans to have to keep our economy moving forward is there. And right now we don't have that, because people are worried about whether or not they're going to be able to pay their next utility bill. They're worried about whether or not they're going to pay their next mortgage. And so I would encourage this government to go back and reconsider the decisions they've made and help to support Albertans with this increased cost of living. Thank you.
Honourable Member, second reading of Bill 2. Are there others? I see the Honourable Member for Edmonton West Henday has risen.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honor to be back here in the House and have an opportunity to speak to Bill 2, the Financial Statutes Amendment Act 2022. And much like...
However, I believe that the Honourable Member has spoken to second reading of Bill 2 previously. Are there others? The Honourable Member for Edmonton Northwest.
Am I good on that one?
Yep, you're
Okay, good. All right. I have a mask on. It's there. See, it really is me. Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the opportunity to just say a few words in regards to the Financial Statutes Amendment Act. And again, I will refer back to some very excellent analysis by the member from Edmonton Manning, just talking about priorities and perception and expectations and responsibilities of a government to the population that does elect it. And I think we see a pretty good case of the abdication of that responsibility and the dashing of expectations and really a lack of direction that this budget kind of points to. And we know that it's important to be fiscally prudent, but this has to be balanced with a sense of what you are responsible for, right? And when it comes down to the provincial budget here and anywhere, really, the lion's share of that expenditure is to the responsibility to healthcare and education and the safety of the population in general. And so what I see, and I think what Albertans see across the province, and I've been traveling around the last couple of weeks quite a lot, Mr. Speaker, to different parts of the province, to Red Deer, to Camrose, to Canmore, Calgary several times, Edmonton, of course. Just wake up and I'm in Edmonton. And what I'm seeing, as been door knocking, obviously, is that there's a real gap between what people are seeing on the ground and what this government is saying in regards to not just their budget, but their style and choices around governance in general. And one of the most striking things that I see, and I hear it on the ground in all of those places and more, is that healthcare is, and access to healthcare is severely curtailed, especially in smaller centers, where you literally have places like Boyle and Edson and southern Alberta, different towns, having to close down their emergencies, or what the equivalent of their emergency is in a town, because they have inadequate staff for those services, And I mean, the reason I mentioned healthcare and then safety and security is that the two, Mr. Speaker, go hand in hand, right? If you live in an area where you have an expectation that, within 30, 40, 50 kilometers even, that you can access emergency care, and suddenly that's not there, right? It literally undermines the safety and the security of your family, even if you don't happen to have an emergency at that moment, right? And you know that it could be there and it might not be there. And, that devalues the ability for people to live in a place. It devalues the property value as well. People say, well, we're going to move here. It looks like a nice place, nice town, and stuff like that. How's the hospital, right? How's the local hospital? You say, well, actually it's shut down half the time because we don't have enough doctors and nurses. Then, literally puts pressure on the development and the economic development and the habitability of a place, right? And so, Mr. Speaker, when I look at this budget and the Financial Statutes Amendment Act, I'm looking at those things. Another element that I talked about, the lion's share of any given provincial budget is, of course, in regards to education. And what my particular responsibility, Mr. Speaker, is for as the official opposition critic for post-secondary education for colleges, universities, polytechnics around the province. Again, we've seen generational cuts, probably some of the biggest cuts in the history of this province, to this sector. And here we are in 2022 with a surplus, and we don't see that turning around, right? At least 690, approaching $700 million taken out of the system in the previous three budgets, and those colleges, universities, and polytechnics, Mr. Speaker, are suffering. They're not just suffering, they're reeling with layoffs, with program closures, and just a real lack of direction for the future. And when you take a certain percentage of money from a facility like a university like Alberta in Edmonton or University of Calgary and so forth, it takes longer for those cuts to be felt. But in some places, I'd be happy to take an interview. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to acknowledge some of the incredible work that you've been doing traveling the province, talking to our post-secondary, whether it's instructors or students or families that are deciding to go into post-secondary, and you talk about the incredible impacts. And I've heard you share some powerful stories here in this House about what's happening with those that are wanting to get into post-secondary but aren't able to because of the cuts that have happened. I mean, you see it every day when you're talking to Albertans and advocating on behalf of them, and you hear their personal struggles and the impacts of the finances and the devastating cuts that this government has made. And I would love it if you could share some of that again in this House, because I don't feel that this government is taking into consideration the personal impact that's being had across the province with so many families, students that are really struggling with the horrible decisions that financially this government is making. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. The honourable member from Castle Downs has, we've been sharing that information and talking about it. But, sometimes stories are the most powerful way by which to really understand what's going on. And the story that I hear compelling over and over again from Fort McMurray down to Lethbridge, right, and the colleges there, is that when you're increasing the tuition rate by 20 to 23%, for example, across the province, and then on top of that, extraordinary tuition increases between 20 to 40, even up to 103% for a certain counseling program at the University of Alberta, then you are literally shutting the door for a certain sector of the population that just can't afford it, right? And if you move from here to here, you're literally disenfranchising thousands of people from even being able to even consider going to university, college, or a polytechnic, or upgrade themselves as well. I mean, I know a certain person in my own family that was accepted to the nurse practitioner program, right? Which is a fantastic program. It really helps with our healthcare system, Mr. Speaker. It really helps to diversify critical care. And I think that this government, at least on paper and in words, does support using more nurse practitioners in our health system, right? So the words and on paper are quite different from what actions do project. And the action is that they've increased the tuition for nurse practitioners so that many people just are not going to go. They literally will not go because they can't afford it, right? And these are usually registered nurses that are already working. They probably maybe have a family and so forth. So they're already, having to budget their time and their money and consider advancing themselves in post-secondary. That's the target for a nurse practitioner. And that program is going to be in trouble because a whole lot of the many people that were considering it, including my own daughter, right, it just isn't possible anymore, right? So there's a story right there, and I think that we could lose a lot of people. And the extension of that story, Mr. Speaker, is that you, for the first time since the early 1980s, we have a net migration of people between 18 and 25 years old out of this province, right? And again, that is a loss that is irreparable and has long-standing effects to our population. If you're losing that critical group of people, right, those young people that we educated through K-12 and set them up and have an expectation for that generation to be here to work and to prosper. If we're losing that, again, we're in big trouble. Don't you think, Mr.
Thank you.
I was going to call you Minister. But
Thank you very much. That's twice today. I appreciate your comments, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about, you're talking about the cuts to our post-secondaries, the impact it's having on driving students out of the province, which is very, very bad for our province, for our economy, for the future. And so I was hoping you could also touch on, the fact that we know technology companies that are looking to relocate across this country or internationally rely on a strong talent pipeline. That's something that we support very much. But this budget has fallen short on funding our post-secondaries. And so I was hoping the member can comment on the impact, not just it'll have on the outflow or outmigration of young people, but what will that do for Alberta companies or for Alberta trying to attract these major players?
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. The honourable member from Beverly Clareview, strikes on an important synergy that was just starting to take root in between post-secondary and technology and here in the province. And we've seen growth in technology of investment across the country. Again, if you are looking at these things as a competition between the 10 provinces and territories, 3 territories, then, everybody's been moving up on this pretty much, right? And Alberta is still lagging behind, right? And it's at that very particular moment, Mr. Speaker, when we need to diversify our economy and working together with trying to keep those young people in the province, then, again, this choice around our budget and supplementary supply and the money we have and resources that we own together, it's not being invested in the right place. Simple as that, right? And if you lose those people, young people, they probably don't come back, right? And if a company sees that the universities or colleges or polytechnics are in any way compromised on a long-term, stable, predictable funding, then, again, people, they vote with their feet, quite frankly, or they just never even come, quite frankly. And, it takes a generation, or many generations in some cases, to build the reputation and the integrity of a post-secondary institution, but it only takes a few months to lose it, right? Lose your reputation, it's gone. Very hard to get back, and that's what's happening now. So between a lack of investment in post-secondary and a lack of, I guess, let's say certainty or security and affordability for young people, I think that's a pretty toxic combination. And we certainly could do better. I know that an investment in post-secondary pays exponential returns. There's no two ways about it. We saw the University of Calgary calculating the literally billions of dollars that the University of Calgary contributes to the city of Calgary's GDP, if we could call it that, right? I mean, it's a bit fluid, but I met with the president again during these last couple of weeks down in Calgary, and he calculated, $5 or $6 billion contribution to the annual economy, overall economy of the city of Calgary, and we could expect that there's some equivalency to that in Edmonton with the University of Alberta, and Lethbridge with the University of Lethbridge, and Olds with Old College, and Vermilion with Lakeland. And I could go on, Mr. Speaker. There's 26 colleges, universities, and polytechnics scattered across this province. It's a unique situation that no other province has, really, is that geographic mix of small, medium, and large polytechnics and trades and universities. But, Mr. Speaker, you don't know what you got until it's gone sometimes. And when a place like Lakeland College or Concordia takes a cut, I was there as well last week, or 10 days ago, they're having to lay off staff, close programs. Concordia is losing its nursing program, for example, which was an important part of servicing not just Camrose, but the whole region, all the way up the highway to social workers as well, right? I mean, if people train in a certain place, they're more likely to stay there too, Mr. Speaker. You know that because, of course, you have Olds College, which really helps to backstop the town of Olds' economy. Simple as that, right? Things may see an economic downturn through energy or whatever, but hey, we always got college, and you can see people playing off the synergy there with the hotel and the brewing program, which I definitely took a tour and tasted some of the beer. It was really good. And the arbitoire that they have there, the synergy of having the high school in the same campus as of the college. I mean, these are all things that happened with a long-term, sustainable investment in funding from the province of Alberta to colleges and universities and polytechnics here in Alberta.
Well, thank you. I've appreciated the members' comments so far in terms of budgeting priorities and how it impacts Albertans when we look at the bill before us. And I think it's important to again note that when we compare the work of the NDP government from 2015 to 2019 and the investments that we did make in post-secondary education to properly freeze post-secondary tuition for Albertans compared to what we've seen under the UCP, where institutions have now actually had to come to the minister and ask for increases of upwards of 100% on some programs. I think it clearly shows the difference in values between the NDP and the UCP, and clearly shows the difference in an understanding of how we support an economy and diversification of our provincial economy, especially when we made those decisions, when the price of oil was so much lower, recognizing that no matter what the price of oil is, Mr. Speaker, we have to ensure that we're supporting Albertans. So it's rich, Mr. Speaker, for lack of better terms, that while we have the price of oil now where it is, we've seen the UCP making these decisions.
Yes, no, and thank you for that. Thank you for bringing me back to, of course, the political realm, right? Which is an important part. So people like to denigrate, political elements to policy and so forth, but it's all about that, really. I mean, at least we have, Mr. Speaker, a democratic way by which we can choose and to constructively engage a population and have alternatives, quite frankly, And again, that's a good reminder, because I don't know what the price of oil is today, but it's got to be close to $100, right? And we were dealing with a $25 barrel back when we were continuing to invest in post-secondary as just one example. And you got to do that. I mean, you see it in other jurisdictions for sure, right? I mean, Ireland, it's always tenuous, their economy. And they ebb and flow and manage, but they realized a long time ago that their biggest asset is their young people and trying to keep them there. And so they have a very affordable college and university program, right, where many of the basic operations and basic tuition is free, right? And the Germans do the same thing, right, knowing full well that, it's not the coal mines of Germany that keep the country going, but, it's the auto industry and their technology industry and so forth, and their biomedical industry, right? Those are the things that move an economy and are something you can be sustainably pointing to for now and the future. So, I mean, those are the kinds of things we need to do here in the province of Alberta, right? I always get a head nod when I talk about these things. The Calgary Chamber of Commerce had put it as their top priorities to invest in the city of Calgary, and as a critical element to a redevelopment policy and program to the downtown, especially to have the universities and colleges being invested much more integrally to downtown Calgary, and it goes on from there, right? You can't find a place that Keanu College, when I was in Fort McMurray, a couple of times in the last few months. Again, people, they just really want that as an anchor to the community. So it's not just a place to work and go, but a place where people can buy houses and start families and have their kids go to college, right? And get a trade education and things like that. So the whole point here, Mr. Speaker, is that, budgets are the enabling tool for all of these other things, right? For education and for healthcare, for safety and security, for building the infrastructure that we need to grow and and all of those things. And Albertans are looking for that, right? Of course, we want to be prudent with our money, and we want to make sure that we're investing and saving for the future as well. But people like to equate the provincial budget with a household budget, and right now, household budgets in Alberta are suffering, and Albertans demand and expect more, and we will be here to help deliver that for them. Thank you.
Are there others? The Honourable Member for Calgary, Boular McCall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak to Financial Statutes Amendment Act. Important piece of legislation that helps this government implement some of the terrible decisions they have made through budget 2022. In the last 2 weeks, Mr. Speaker, I have the pleasure of attending many different events in my constituency, and I had the opportunity to talk to many people about the issues facing them. And while the government is busy patting themselves on the back for the increase in WTI price, people are hurting. Their budgets are not balanced, and they're struggling to make ends meet. In my riding in particular, the Northeast Calgary, I represent some of the neighborhoods that are among the neighborhoods with lowest per capita income in comparison to many other neighborhoods in the city of Calgary. Taradale, Martindale, Saddle Ridge, all of them have average household income around $29,000, $30,000 as compared to the average in Calgary of $42,000 to $45,000. Which means that the increases in their insurance costs, increases to their utility bills, impact them way harder than some people in other neighborhoods. I mean, these impacts are difficult to digest for many Albertans across this province, but because I represent some of those neighborhoods with people who have been impacted already a fair bit by this government policies, they have been particularly hit hard. And while they have income tax opened, what this government could have done to help Albertans was they could have reversed the changes they have made to income tax exemption brackets. That bracket creep that Premier used to call while in Arwa insidious and pernicious tax grab. That decision alone is taking almost $500 from those Albertans' pocket at a time when they need that money the most. And it's costing Albertan across this province almost $1 billion. And government is working overtime to do everything. That doesn't help people in my riding and people across this province. At a time when cost of living is going up, like from utility bills, insurance costs, tuition fees, and even park fees. This government is bending backwards to find more ways to tax Albertans, and especially tax those Albertans who are in the lowest tax brackets, all the while giving billions of dollars to the most profitable corporations. For instance, when we talk about insurance, the first step that this government took was to remove the 5% increase cap on the premiums. And I remember government trying to convince us that unless they do so, insurance companies will leave the province, insurance business won't be viable, and whatnot. And they were standing with the insurance companies and not with the Albertans. And they then even tried to hide the annual report detailing the premiums, claims, payouts, all those things, so that Albertan won't find out that their decision was not based on facts. Their decision was to please their friends, lobbyists, and insiders. And last week, we found out that insurance companies made over $1 billion in the last 2 years. Even during the pandemic, where every business was hurting, every small business was hurting, Albertans were hurting, they were struggling to make ends meet. I'll take the internet.
Thank you. I think it's important to highlight how some of these decisions are being made. You talked about a government that makes decisions based on what their friends need, not what the average Albertan needs. And you talk about businesses struggling, you talk about families struggling. So there's so many examples of decisions that this government has made that are based on supporting their friends. The insurance companies, for example, that you highlighted. We know when we talk about how the financial decisions made by this government impact families, what are those implications? What happens to a family in Alberta when they're looking at their budget and they see that this government is making decisions to support their friends and not the average Albertan? What does that family budget look like because of the financial decisions that this government has made, because of the decisions that they've made to support their friends, not Albertans? I'd like to hear a little bit more about what that means for a family who's struggling to cover the cost of insurance.
Thank you for this important question. Last weekend, I was in Banff, and I went out door knocking with my colleague from Edmonton, Glenora, and we stopped at a house where a single mom spoke to us. She was a barber, and she shared her story with us. Her business is not doing well. She was barely making her end meet throughout this pandemic. And now her utilities have gone up almost double, from $300 to $650. Her insurance has gone up. And basically, she wasn't able to pay the rent because she was worried that her utilities will be cut off. So these are real people. These are real Albertans who are impacted by this government's decision not to take action, not to do anything to make life affordable for Albertans. They promised a relief of $50 on utilities. And on the gas, that relief doesn't come in, kicks in yet. If their bills, if Albertans' bills are going up like from $300 to $600, $700, $50 a month does not make much a difference. And these increases are a direct result of this government removing the 6.8 cents per kilowatt hour cap that we had in place. That's the result, direct result of government removing that cap in favor of the corporations, in favor of their friends, and leaving Albertan on their own to fend for themselves. That's how out of touch this government is from Albertans and issues facing them. Take another intervention.
Well, thank you. Appreciate the honourable member from Bular, the call. We all have critic areas, and what I'm curious to know is how is this budget affecting your critic area specifically. I know that we've seen a lot of delays in the execution of justice here in the province of Alberta. And, I know just anecdotally from my neighbor I was talking to yesterday, right? He said that, I have cases that get deferred so many times, they're lost. They literally are gone, right? So whatever transaction or whatever issue it is, right, after a certain period of time, without the timely intervention and a court date or appearance and so forth, you lose that case.
Thank you. That's a really important question. Over last 3 budgets, this UCP government has cut over $200 million from the justice system. Over $200 million from the justice system. And they have not done anything to address backlogs, to address Jordan delays, and to address the delays that have and will result from the pandemic. People who want to have day in court, they are seeing their perpetrators walk scot-free, their cases being dropped in front of them. And it's the government that claims they're tough on crimes and whatnot. They have not done anything to address those delays. And they had that opportunity in this budget to make up for those cuts, talk to the stakeholders in the justice system, listen to their needs, and provide for what they need so that Albertan can get the justice, Albertan can access the court system in a timely manner. And instead, what's happening? Prosecutors are not happy with them. They are even thinking of strike action. And some of those stakeholders can't even get a meeting with government ministers so that they can discuss and share their concerns. That's how bad the situation is. And back to what I was talking about, I was talking about how government had this opportunity to fix many things and fix at least the rising costs that is resulting directly from this government policies. But they chose not to do that. Instead, this government is piling on the costs for average Albertans. In just one simple policy bracket creep, that is costing Albertans $500 a month. And when you're working on minimum wage, when you're single income earner, that $500 makes a huge difference. Albertans are also losing around $450 because the Alberta child tax benefit is being indexed by this government. Albertans on senior benefit. Again, these are Albertans who are on fixed income. They are losing $750. And under this government plan, and with this budget 2022, an ISH recipient will lose $3,000 in real purchasing power. Mr. Speaker, these are the decisions that this government could have reversed in this budget, in this piece of legislation. But they are choosing not to because they do not care, they do not listen. Only people who have access to government in their ears are big, profitable corporations. And even when they were giving them billions of dollars, they promised that that will create jobs, that will bring prosperity back to Alberta, that will help us fill downtown Calgary. Mr. Speaker, none of that happened. Those corporations, they got hundreds of millions of dollars. And what they did, they laid off people here in Alberta in downtown Calgary. And downtown Calgary is still sitting at 30% vacancy rate. And what the government solution is, they are giving $5 million to City of Calgary to fill it up. That's how bad, that's how out of touch they are from the reality. With that, Mr. Speaker, I move that we adjourn debate on Bill 2.
Honourable members, having heard the motion as proposed by the Honourable Member for Calgary, Boular-McCall, to adjourn debate, all those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. In my opinion, the ayes have it. That motion is carried and so ordered.
Government bills in order for second reading. Bill 10, Health Professions Protecting Women and Girls, Amendment Act 2022. Adjourn debate. Mr. Getson.
Honourable members, before the Assembly, Bill 10, second reading. The Honourable Member for Edmonton Northwest.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'm sure we'll have time for everyone to have a few words in regards to Bill 10, Health Professions Protecting Women and Girls Amendment Acts. I see this bill as following quite closely federal legislation from some time ago that criminalized this activity and, in fact, criminalized the aiding and abetting of this as a practice as well. And so, you know, that is the main domain of this, the abolition and the criminalization of this practice. And, we should keep that in mind, of course, when we are debating this bill. I mean, that being said, I'm always an advocate of, Madam Speaker, to ensure that we are providing some support for federal legislation that we do agree with, and to provide an educative component to federal legislation that is the main driver of this particular practice. And so I guess that's what we're doing with Bill 10, and I do support that as such. I think it's important for us to realize really what my understanding is, that we're aiming for to send a message to people who otherwise would consider sending a woman or a girl to another place to have these operations of this cuts to take place, and just to reinforce the message to anybody considering that number one, it's against the law, Canadian law, and number two, any aiding and abetting of an individual to engage in this practice is against the law too, right? So if we can get that message to people from various cultures that might consider this, I think that's a worthwhile thing to do, right? And although I don't have a great deal of knowledge about female genital mutilation here in this country, I know that in many countries in Africa, that this is something that governments, federal governments and state governments in various republics and countries around Africa are taking a sharp focus on this problem, right? And again, trying to, certainly criminalize and recognize the. Sorry. Oh. Sure. Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Here I am standing right by. Thanks, Dan. You're the best.
I thank you for the intervention, and I think that you raise a really good point, Honourable Member, is that there is a lack of understanding about this practice, and I think a key part of that could be an education component, especially when it comes to the healthcare professionals in how they support women in this process and support those to help destigmatize what's happening. And so, you come from a post-secondary lens, and I think that by talking about, some of the supports that could be provided at the post-secondary level, when those that are entering the healthcare practice should be educated on this very, very harmful practice. So when we're looking at the post-secondary lens, what healthcare professionals do you think should be educated about female genital cutting, and how can that impact the education of those that are serving women going forward? And so I think that when we're talking about something that is not well known, it's important to consider education. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Honourable Member. I think that is our purview here, considering it is a federal law that we're dealing with, and part of moving cultural practices, away from dangerous situations and so forth, is to not just bring down the full hammer of the law and try to put somebody in jail and throw away the key kind of thing, right? But rather for people to understand that not just in Canada, but perhaps in their place of origin, that this process of education and moving away from female genital mutilation is happening as well, right? So, in a place like Kenya, for example, there's active programs for health and and it's a question of power too. I think is that if you are imposing this on women and girls, that it's an imposition of dominance and gender dominance as well, right? And so when you're trying to build a modern society in a place like Kenya or in Mozambique or in Tanzania or Zimbabwe, that you must address these things full on. And so I think for us, as part of in different cultural communities in Alberta, let's say that this might have some residual activity still, that you can work with people and educators and with doctors and public health people as well. And part of that message is that we're trying to move away from this, not just, of course, in Canada, it's by criminalization, but this is also happening in perhaps your country of origin, right? So so it's better to not do this, and it's better that for the health of women and girls and the overall equality and sense of justice in a society, that you can follow from that angle as well. So these are things that I think that we can do, and and just I must say though, Madam Speaker, is that we I think need to address a larger issue here, which is that do we have adequate access to health care, especially community health care, that can best provide this combination of of medical advice and culturally sensitive intervention. You know, like you can't do that at the emergency room at the ALEC, right? I mean, it's like all the things going on, and it's where you can perhaps affect positive change the best through preventative medicine, of which I think this should fall under, right? Preventative medicine for sure, to dissuade people from this practice. That's where community health comes in, and having that reach and that trust and that sensitivity and perhaps even language capacity to talk to people and to work with them to move away from these kinds of activities, right? I mean, that's where you can actually be effective, Madam Speaker. And, you know, what I see in my own community and right across the province is that those community health programs are being cut, right? They're being cut by this UCP government, and they are losing their effectiveness by lack of staffing and by sort of a bad relationship with the healthcare professionals that staff and actually make community health centers work and function. And so, Madam Speaker, again, we can't talk about specific procedures and so forth without discussing the support system that actually makes those things work, right? We can say, again, it's like on paper with, my last discussion around post-secondary, that we support education and post-secondary, and you write it down on a piece of paper and you say it out loud here in this chamber or outside. But if you were literally cutting with the other hand at the same time, that same program, the actual critical infrastructure that supports it, then it doesn't make any sense, right? And so, Madam Speaker, again, we can certainly help through the criminalization of this cultural practice and to support it through education. I mean, you can have a one-two combination on that, but our job here in Alberta is to educate. Education takes resources. To use community health outreach to know that people, women and girls and families that are choosing not to do this, they're supported and encouraged, in fact. And again, you can't just do that with words and on paper. You have to do it with actual supports. And lo and behold, if you do, Madam Speaker, invest in community health, there's all kinds of ancillary benefits that come from that. People are more conscious about preventative parts of their health care and know that they have the security of a community health unit that is there when they need it for themselves and for their family. All of those things, right, are good. So, yeah, again, I certainly support Bill 10, and I just wanted to point out that, it doesn't exist in isolation. It has to be in concert with community health initiatives that all Albertans want and need for themselves and for their family. Thank you.
Are there any other members wishing to speak? The Honourable Member for Edmonton Manning.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I will be supporting this bill as my colleague has articulated previously. I do have some thoughts in regards to the legislation and just how, once passed, what it will look like in relation to implementation. I do want to echo the importance of education and ensuring that women and girls have the understanding and the knowledge when it comes to female genital mutilation and their rights as women. I think that, again, this speaks to a variety of concerns when it comes to women being put into positions where they may be vulnerable or there may be power differentials between the relationships that they're part of. Again, working as a social worker previously to this and working with youth, I continuously had concerns about the young women and the girls that I was working with and those relationships that they were having within their communities. I think that there is a need to ensure that as women are growing up, they understand their rights, that they understand their sexual reproductive health and their options, and that they understand what a healthy relationship looks like, and that the people that are around them also are respectful of those positions and the autonomy of a woman's body. When I worked in this profession, one of my major concerns was always around ensuring that the women and girls that I worked with weren't being victimized, that weren't being trafficked, that weren't being brought into situations and coerced into environments where they were being put into environments like sex trafficking or human trafficking. And so I think, again, we have a responsibility when we talk about pieces of legislation like this, that we are ensuring that as much education and support is being provided to women and girls so that they have that understanding and they have those supports in place. I believe that, because it isn't something that is discussed very often, our healthcare professionals also need to be aware of those conversations, the requests being made, and then how do they work with families and how do they work within communities to ensure that the rights of the women are being protected, and that there isn't pressure being put on young girls to have this procedure done, and that their personal health is being protected as much as possible. So I guess some of the questions that I would have when this bill is passed in this chamber, if that is to happen, is that what is the government doing to ensure that our health professionals have the resources available to them to be able to manage situations such as this? Oh, I see an intervention.
I know in the work that we've done as social workers, it's often a multidisciplinary approach that we take to working with families. And I know when we look at the cuts specifically to social work of 11% from this government, that also has an impact when we're talking about how we best support the women and girls specific to Bill 10. And I think that there is an importance to understand that when we're working in community and we're working with the well-being of individuals, we need to look at it from a community best practice. And part of that best practice is using multidisciplinary approach. And so I know this member has the same background as I with social work, and we often worked very closely with healthcare providers. We were often the first point of contact when it came to some of these young, vulnerable women when they're being victimized. And so having that importance of that education piece when it comes to not just healthcare workers, but the multidisciplinary team is important.
Well, thank you, Honourable Member, and I appreciate the comments. I think, again, looking at that multidisciplinary approach, one of the things that we do know in other jurisdictions in relation to female genital mutilation is that the Society of Obstetricians and Gynecologists of Canada state that it is mandatory for its members to report if they suspect that a female child's been subject to FGM or is going to be subjected. It is considered a child welfare protection issue. Now, of course, because of that speaks to the importance of having that multidisciplinary approach. You want your pediatricians to be able to be educated in understanding the signs and the concerns that the behaviors that you may see within a family in relation to this. You want to make sure that you have social workers available that are able to respond to the child intervention matters, child protection matters, if there is a flag or an identification of this. But not only just within the medical profession, I think we also see this in the education system, as well as our child care system. Many people who are engaging with children at all different stages of life need to have the education and understanding of what signs and indications there may be in relation to a child that may be at risk of having this procedure happen or have had happen. Again, I think because it isn't something that is necessarily discussed often. I'll be honest, as a child intervention worker, this wouldn't have been something that I would have had on my radar as a concern that would have been brought forward to me. In fact, I have never had this issue flagged to me as a risk factor for a young girl or a female child. And so even my knowledge and understanding would have been very limited had I had a referral made to me as a child intervention worker. And so I would have required some understanding and some education to be able to work through the different factors that would relate to the family that we would be working with. So I do think that, it is definitely something where the government, as they move forward with this piece of legislation, make sure that communities are aware and they understand. It's one thing to have a piece of legislation introduced into the chamber, but the policies and the regulations that will be created because of it need to be ensured to be passed along to the people that will be managing and working within this legislation. I don't particularly see, to be honest, within the legislation how this would transfer to some of those multidisciplinary professions and ensuring that people, one, are even aware that this legislation is happening. And then what does that look like in best practice? Where do health providers go to develop the skills that they'll need to be able to manage this? What kind of cultural awareness practices will be required? What kind of ability to be able to have conversation and dialogue around this issue to ensure the best outcome of the child? And I don't see how that is happening. I trust that our medical professionals are very capable of having conversations when it comes to medical procedures, but we're dealing with other complexities when we speak to this very issue. And so for me, it's not the legislation that I have questions about, it's just the way that we speak about it, it's the terminology that is used, it's the engagement with communities, it's ensuring that all healthcare professionals and multidisciplinary professionals have an understanding and an ability to work through this so that, one, they know how to report if there is a concern. Two, how, if there is a report of a protection issue, social workers like myself would have an understanding to even be able to engage in the conversation. And then, of course, all the other factors that would surround this practice in the sense of risk factors in relation to vulnerable populations. How do we ensure that there isn't types of human trafficking occurring? All the other matters that relate to the overall health of young women that may be involved in children intervention services. So I would like to hear from the government at some point around what the next step would be if this bill were to pass. And will there be experts, will there be funding available for medical professionals to have an understanding or an expertise in this area? What will that look like? Because it's one thing to have a piece of legislation, but if it's not actually going to have the outcome, then I guess the question would be is what is the intent? Because, we know that we can create legislation in this place, but if it doesn't actually transfer to a workable policy or a regulation that Albertans are able to use, it's kind of a moot point. And so my hope is that this bill is not being going to be something that is potentially approved or passed within this chamber and then forgotten about. And so hopefully someone on the government side at some point can give a little bit more information, I guess would be the best word, about how this will then be used as best practice. And with that, I will take my seat.
Are there others? The Honourable Member for Edmonton Gold Bar.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank all of my friends here from the official opposition for offering some comments on Bill 10, and I hope that I can build on some of the issues that my friend from Edmonton Manning raised in her comments on this bill. And this is around her requests for providing education to new Canadian communities and better supports for those communities. And I really want to underline this point, Mr. Speaker, because I do support the bill, and I want to thank the member from Chestermere Strathmore for her work in bringing forward this piece of legislation. But although I do support the bill, I am not entirely convinced that the requirements for healthcare professionals to report instances of female genital mutilation to law enforcement bodies will be sufficient to curtail the practice here in the province of Alberta. In her comments when she introduced the bill, Mr. Speaker, the member from Chestermere Strathmore said that while she admitted that the practice doesn't happen here in Alberta, and I sincerely hope that that's true, but that there are communities of people who send their girls to their home countries, or to the countries of origin rather, to have this practice performed on them. I guess I don't see the link, because I don't see the link between requiring healthcare professionals to report these cases to law enforcement and actually preventing this from happening. Because healthcare professionals presumably won't know that some little girl has had this done to her until it's too late. And then law enforcement will be informed, and then they can step in and carry out whatever punishments are available to them under the criminal code. But that it doesn't fully explain to me how that will prevent this from happening in the future, other than perhaps other members of that family will be spared from being sent abroad to having this done. One of the things that I've seen over and over again as a member from Edmonton Gold Bar for the last 7 years is the lack of appropriate cultural supports to help new Canadians raise their families here in an entirely new cultural context that they find themselves. I represent a riding that is the home to a number of organizations dedicated to advancing the interests and well-being of Francophone African communities primarily. And one of the things that I've heard over and over again from organizations that work with these Francophone African communities is the lack of appropriate cultural supports to families in learning how to raise their children in a Canadian context. And my friend from Edmonton Manning talked about that in her comments. She mentioned that in her time as a child intervention worker, she was not aware that this was even a practice. Didn't have the education, I guess, or the knowledge to potentially even have the conversation with families that she might be working in. And I think if we want to be successful in preventing this practice from being carried out on children who are currently living in Alberta, then we need to provide the appropriate cultural supports. They're not there. The communities that are present that live and work in Gold Bar tell me over and over again how frustrated they are to deal with the Children's Services Department when there are very few people of African origin working in the department. There is nobody who speaks French who can talk to them. And I think this is a critical piece that needs to be in place if we want to prevent this practice from happening. And I see that I've generated an intervention from my friend from Edmonton Castle Downs, so I'd entertain that now.
Thank you very much, Honourable Member. I think it's really important, the discussion that we're having here in the Chamber, especially when it comes to the lack of understanding with the professionals that are working within these communities of newcomers. And I know that you were the previous Minister of Post-Secondary, and you had that hands-on approach with talking with students and what their needs are. Do you see a place within the post-secondary system to start that education process, to see, we have a piece of legislation here that really does nothing to actually provide support to those that need it, to provide support to those in their first language, to provide support to those with a cultural context. Is there an opportunity within the post-secondary system to perhaps provide that education piece, to talk to the families of newcomers, to say, what do you need? What is missing in the services that you're trying to access? Where are the gaps? And how can the post-secondary institutions perhaps provide a liaison to those gaps?
Thank you to my friend from Edmonton Castle Downs for asking the question. And I think there are a couple of things that I would like post-secondary education, or the Ministry of Advanced Education, broadly speaking, to address. Now, I understand that the Ministry of Advanced Education doesn't dictate curriculum to post-secondary education institutions the same way that the Minister of Education is intent on dictating a 50-year-old curriculum to the primary and secondary education systems here in the province. But I would encourage all of the post-secondary education institutions to have a look at their curricula for social work students, for example, or other people who are looking or who will be entering this field, to see if the education contains the appropriate cultural components that those students will be dealing with when they go to work. And I certainly think that the ministry has an important role to play in terms of providing adequate financial support for institutions to undertake those reviews and make those changes to the curriculum. I think where the Ministry of Advanced Education could play a much more proactive role is in at least providing adequate English language learning services to new Canadians. This is something that was identified as an issue that we began working on when I was minister, but there are thousands of new Canadians who just don't have access to appropriate English language learning lessons because their benefits are cut off before they can reach an appropriate level of English language proficiency. And I think that that's something that the government would be well able to address, because we have to admit that language barrier is a significant issue when we're dealing with these incredible cultural gaps that we have to cross in order to address this issue. And so we literally need to be speaking the same language, I think, in order to be able to address the issue. And I think English language learning would help us go a long way. I want to wrap up my point by just urging the government to take meaningful and immediate action on providing French language services to Francophone African communities in the province of Alberta to prevent these kinds of things from happening. Now, I honestly don't know. This isn't something that the Francophone African communities have raised with me. And part of the issue is that I'm a man, and the people that I'm speaking to in the communities are often men. And this kind of issue is, as a member from Chestermere Strathmore indicated when she introduced the legislation, is something that is talked about between women and passed on from grandmother to grandmother, as she said in her speech. But the point is that we need child intervention people, workers who come from an African background and can speak French, so that they can deal with the families in an appropriate cultural context and work with them to explain to them the Canadian context for raising children. And I think that if we provided that we would go a long way to preventing this practice from being carried out in the future. The other piece that touches on the intervention from my friend from Edmonton Castle Downs is we need to improve the representation in the faculties of the healthcare professionals who will be working with these communities. You know, I will say that med schools, by and large, have very diverse populations, and they should be a model for other healthcare professional faculties. But I don't think that we have the same kind of diversity in associated healthcare professions. And I think that that's something that also needs to be addressed. We need to have more healthcare workers coming from different cultural backgrounds so that they understand what families are dealing with when they're making these decisions to send their children to their countries of origin, to undergo these practices, and to help prevent them from engaging in those practices. So there is a lot that needs to be done in addition to the measures that are in this bill to take meaningful action to prevent this kind of practice from being carried out in the future. And I really urge all government members to look at what additional supports and practices can be put in place, both in the child intervention system and in the healthcare education system, to address this issue meaningfully. With that, Mr. Speaker, I will conclude my remarks. Thank you.
Are there others? Second reading to Bill 10, the honourable member for Edmonton Beverly Clairview.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's my privilege to rise and speak to Bill 10, the Health Professions Protecting Women and Girls Amendment Act, and to speak to this very serious matter. Mr. Speaker, I'll start off by thanking the member from Chestermere Strathmore for introducing this piece of legislation on this very, very important topic. Mr. Speaker, I know that female genital mutilation is illegal under the criminal code, as it should be. Performance of FGM is also already an offense under the Health Professions Act, and as such, as well with the College of Physicians and Surgeons. Now, I appreciate the opportunity that this bill is giving all members of the chamber to talk about women's health, the importance of women's health. And I also want to touch on a number of points that my colleagues have made. I really appreciated hearing from my colleague, the member for Edmonton Gold Bar, on his references to a number of points, but specifically talking about his experience over the past 6+ years representing the people of Edmonton Gold Bar and some of the challenges that his diverse group of constituents have raised over the past several years, and a number of ways that the government could enhance this piece of legislation that we are discussing before us today. First of all, I think it's becoming clear from a number of points that colleagues have made that, yes, this bill does address the legal consequences and ramifications for our healthcare professionals when it comes to FGM, but what is missing in the legislation is that really important piece around education. And, I appreciate the fact, my understanding is that the government has indicated that will come through regulations, but I think, Mr. Speaker, the educational component is absolutely paramount to changing and preventing future cases or instances of FGM. And for that reason, it should be debated in this chamber. It should be open to the public. We should be engaging with our healthcare professionals to ensure that they have a voice in what that education looks like. I appreciate colleagues of mine have spoken about the role of our post-secondary institutions and how they play a critical role in that education. It should start as young professionals are working their way through earning their credentials, not waiting for them as graduates. Now, granted, for those that obviously have already graduated, it's important that they also have an opportunity for education, you know, in a number of different areas, from again being trained to recognize the different signs, to providing supports for women and girls who have gone through this. Now, you know, I won't pretend to be an expert or even to have a thorough knowledge of this area, but I do think it's important that we provide our healthcare professionals with all of the tools that they need to be successful and to support, you know, the very women and girls that we are trying to protect and support through this piece of legislation. You know, Mr. Speaker, the member for Edmonton Goldbar brought up some very good points around language services and ensuring that our you know, new Canadians and folks who have come from other countries have all of the supports that they need to be successful. And so, you know, whether that's through English language learning services, which I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, years ago I had an opportunity to attend an ELL class that was being taught, or the classes occurred in the Clareview Rec Center, and was incredible to participate in just, you know, one short class, but the impact that has, and I know that those kind of services require government support, maybe not government to deliver, but at least through, you know, not-for-profits or community organizations that are on the ground in local communities who know exactly who their clientele are and can tailor those classes to the very folks that are participating in them. But that requires support. And I see I have a friendly intervention. I will kindly accept it.
Thank you, Honourable Member. I think you made a really good point in your comments, in that there's nothing in this legislation that actually addresses the support of women and girls. And the title of this bill talks about women and girls, and that is glaringly obvious that is missing. So to me, not having voice of those that are impacted is huge. And I know that your background is education and that you worked with vulnerable youth, and I just think of the importance of your experience working with youth and being able to hear their voice, right? Like being able to hear what they need, and having that perspective of actually having those that we're trying to help and support, having them share their voice. And so as an educator, having hands-on experience with vulnerable youth, you worked in high-risk youth, you were able to see what they needed because they told you. And so having that is essential, I think.
Yeah, thank you very much to the member from Edmonton Castle Downs for that really important point. It is absolutely critical to ensure that the very people that we are trying to help have a voice and participate in the solution that we're trying to get to. You know, I was very privileged to work at Edmonton's Inner City High School for 6 years, working with very high-risk youth. I mean, you know, I like to describe them as young people who have been unsuccessful in the traditional system. You know, for a number of reasons. They face barriers. In my experience, they face more barriers than the average student does, and for a myriad of reasons. And this is, you know, no fault to our public system, but the services that are provided currently through many of our public schools are insufficient. And we often talk about wraparound services, but you know, I can tell you that these young people face incredible odds. I can only imagine. Yet show up to school every day because they want to change their circumstances, and they do so voluntarily. which is absolutely incredible. And so, quite frankly, part of the reason I decided to run more than 15 years ago was because I saw that the system needed to be improved and that we needed to get more supports to young people. Ironically, not less, which is where we are today with the current UCP government. But when it comes to this bill, I think the member for Edmonton Castle Downs raised a really good point that at the moment, the way the bill is currently written, I don't see how the very women and girls that this bill is meant to help, how their voices are reflected in this piece of legislation. And so, again, I think, quite frankly, if members of the government were in the opposition benches, they would be asking our government the exact same question of where is that reflected, and can we get that in the legislation? Let's not wait for the regulations, which of course are done by cabinet behind closed doors. And so, let's engage with folks to ensure that all voices are represented. I don't know, honestly, who the member for Chestermere and Strathmore engaged with and consulted with in drafting this legislation. I would hope that she has engaged with those who have experienced this firsthand. But again, the two pieces that I think could strengthen this legislation are ensuring that women and girls have a voice through this legislation, and as well a critical piece, that educational piece, to ensure that we are doing everything we can to provide our healthcare professionals and educators with the tools and education that they need to be able to identify when these practices have occurred, to support the very victims of these practices. And so, my hope is that the government is open to not just a robust debate, but to ideas and potentially amendments from the opposition, but equally from government members as well, in order to ensure that we have the strongest piece of legislation that we can moving forward to do what I believe the member from Chestermere Strathmore has stated in this chamber, to prevent these practices from happening. And so with that, Mr. Speaker, I will take my seat and listen to the rest of the debate on this bill as we move forward. Thank you.
Are there others? The honourable member for Edmonton West Henday.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a privilege to rise to speak to Bill 10, the Health Professions Protecting Women and Girls Amendment Act. I've appreciated the conversations that we've heard so far, the thoughts and comments, and especially from the member from Chestermere Strathmore, who obviously finds this issue very important, and it shows through the discussions that they've brought forward in the legislature regarding this important and very sensitive issue. And so I thank that member in their responsibility as the previous minister handling this issue, as well as a private member, more recently for bringing forward this issue and giving us all the opportunity to speak to it. I think that we've heard from many members at this point that, in some cases, or as far as female genital mutilation goes, it is currently illegal under the criminal code, and that makes sense. It should be the case. And again, when we look at the Health Professions Act, that performing this type of FGM procedure is a criminal act through that association as well. And so there are codes in place that are dealing with this already on a federal level and from a health professions standpoint. But I think with that being said, but from a College of Physicians and Surgeons standpoint, but the fact that the member wants to bring this into the Health Professions Act, I think is a reasonable step forward. And so you know, I think that we have heard a lot of important conversations around, while this being a valuable step forward, it's important to recognize that this should just be one step in that direction and not necessarily the last step. I think that the member who brought this legislation forward has made it clear that there is more regulations to come from this, and so I am very interested to see how the consultation process moving forward will take shape and what we might expect to see after those regulations and further consultations are happening, because again, this is important that we get this right, not only through this step, but also through what's to come in regards to, will we see proposals for ensuring that this is taught on an educational level to healthcare professionals as they are going through post-secondary or even before, Mr. Speaker, ensuring that education is in place to recognize when this might be taking place, and for ensuring that those physicians and surgeons understand the steps following that from the law perspective, and from ensuring sensitivity on the issue, and so on and so forth, Mr. Speaker. I think, again, as we've heard from many members on this side of the House, the fact is, we can put this type of legislation forward, but if we aren't ensuring that there is healthcare providers in communities who are prepared to address this, and Mr. Speaker, are there in the first place, that this legislation won't do as much as the member might expect it to. And we've heard again and again that many communities across the province are currently without primary care networks, potentially without physicians and family GPs. And so we need to ensure that we are doing everything we can to provide those wraparound services, to ensure that there are supports in place to tackle this issue and many other issues regarding such services. And so we continue to be very concerned that, Mr. Speaker, hundreds of millions of dollars have gone unspent when it comes to the healthcare system, especially as we move through the pandemic, and even more so, it is an even bigger concern, Mr. Speaker, when we look at rural communities and communities outside of the major centers, while it's, of course, an issue inside our urban communities as well. And so, Mr. Speaker, again, I have appreciated the conversations that we've heard about this. I think that there is more that we can do on this issue, but I appreciate the member from Chestermere Strathmore for bringing this forward, for beginning those conversations, ones on an issue that are quite clearly very important to that member, and I thank all members for taking part in this debate and discussion. Thank you.
Are others? The Honourable Member for Calgary, Boular, McCall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak. To Bill 10, Health Professionals Protecting Women and Girls Amendment Act 2022. And I'd like to begin by thanking member from Chestermere Strathmore for bringing forward this piece of legislation. We don't hear about this very often, and I think this piece of legislation will certainly help us raise awareness about an issue that's not very often talked about. I went to social work school with a diverse group of students back in 2007, 2008, and that's the first time I heard about it. And I think that, as was said in this House, that it's outside criminal code, and it's currently not being practiced in Canada, so we don't hear a whole lot about it. But I was looking up on World Health Organization website, and I was shocked that there are 200 million women and girls that are subjected to this practice. That's 200 million girls and women. That's a violation, a brutal violation of rights of girls and women. And as this bill was moved from private member bill to government bill, I hope that at the later stages, member from Jasmine Strathmore or other members of this House will be able to bring forward amendments, and government will be willing to attach some money with it, with this bill, so that this bill can carry out its intended purpose. It can raise awareness about this important issue, and it can take steps to make sure that directly or indirectly this practice is not happening in any way, shape, or manner in our society. When this bill was last before the House, that was before the constituency break, and I did take some notes, and a member from Lethbridge East mentioned that it was not within our jurisdiction, and while criminal code is also not within our jurisdiction, but Alberta Health Profession Act does prohibit it, and the provision contained in this legislation will further strengthen those prohibitions and make sure that if health professionals come to know about this, there is proper procedures in place and there is some reporting mechanism. What I really want to talk about when a member from Strathmore, Jasmine Strathmore was speaking to this bill, she mentioned that it's not happening in Canada, but there are girls, there are women that who are sent to their countries to perform this procedure, and then they are brought back to Canada. I think it's deeply concerning if this is happening in Alberta, in Canada, in this day and age. And we do not have, I tried to research as much as I can, but we do not have any information, any data to show how often that's happening. Where is that happening? Which communities it's happening in? And this bill does not address that whether we will be doing anything to make sure that it's not happening and girls and kids are not sent to the countries to be subjected to this inhumane practice. So my hope is that at a later stage, government will look into it. Now that it's a government bill, government certainly has resources at their disposal, that they will put in some effort and share with the House any information that they can gather about the extent of this practice happening here in Canada indirectly. And I think we also need to find ways that how we can work with the communities where this practice is happening and provide them with the supports that they need, provide them with the information they need so that we can put an end to this practice. And as my colleague from Edmonton, Goldbar, mentioned, that people who come here as newcomers, they often face many barriers, from cultural understanding to language barriers. And I think one way of supporting those communities will be that we are able to provide language supports so that they can learn about the systems here, learn about the culture here, learn about the laws here, and be able to adjust themselves accordingly. But in the absence of those supports, that becomes very difficult. I represent a constituency that has quite a high number of people with English as second language. And what this government has done in last couple of budgets, this budget in particular, they've even completely cut a program called Learner Support that was providing language support to newcomers. And they replaced that with a new program that is completely at the discretion of Minister of Advanced Education. And people will only get supports. People will only get supports if there is money and Minister of Advanced Education decides to provide support for that program. But on one hand, government wants to raise awareness about this practice. Government wants to put an end to this practice. But at the same time, government is also cutting those vital supports that will help us raise awareness of this practice and put an end.
Member, I hesitate to interrupt, but pursuant to Standing Order 4, 2.1, the House stands adjourned until this afternoon at 1:30.